It is the night of August 17th, 2026, and at the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, trucks are still crossing in both directions, business as usual, except it is not. Every driver in that line knows that in less than 48 hours, on August 19th, a 50% tariff is scheduled to hit almost $20 billion of Canadian goods entering the United States. Wine, beer, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, dairy, electronics. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, this is not a threat anymore. It is a proclamation, signed, dated, and sitting on a countdown clock. And in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney is telling reporters that Canada is prepared to hit back, but not yet, not until the clock actually runs out. That single detail is the whole story in miniature. Not a country lashing out, a country waiting, calculating, holding its punch until the very last possible second. And that is why this moment matters so much more than another tariff headline. Because for the first time in this 2-year trade war, Ottawa is not just absorbing pressure from Washington. It is applying pressure right back on a timeline it controls. To understand why August 19th became such a pressure point, you have to rewind 18 months back to February 1st, 2025. That is when President Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing near universal tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. 25% on almost everything from Canada, 10% specifically on energy products. At the time, it was framed as a response to border security concerns and trade imbalances. Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister then, and he announced Canada would retaliate with 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, a number that was set to balloon to $155 billion within 3 weeks if the dispute escalated. Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, promised its own countermeasures. Within days, what had been a trading relationship built over decades under NAFTA, and then its replacement, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, was an open conflict. By March of 2025, Mark Carney had replaced Trudeau as Prime Minister, inheriting a trade war that was already reshaping daily life on both sides of the border. Provinces began pulling American products off shelves. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO, pulled U.S. alcohol from its stores entirely. Nova Scotia doubled toll rates on commercial vehicles crossing from the United States and pulled American liquor from its own provincial retailer. The Ontario government canceled a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, one province and territory after another, began reviewing procurement policies to avoid American vendors altogether. This was not just a government-to-government dispute. It became a grassroots movement. Historians and trade analysts would later refer to it as the 2025 to 2026 Canadian boycott of the United States, driven partly by the tariffs themselves and partly by Trump's repeated public suggestions that Canada could become the 51st American state, a comment that Canadian officials and citizens alike treated as a serious insult to national sovereignty, not as a joke. Here is where the story gets its first real turning point. By August of 2025, Canada actually pulled back. Ottawa removed the majority of its own retaliatory tariffs, canceling roughly $14.2 billion in counter tariffs that had been in place since March of that year. On the surface, that looked like Canada backing down. In practice, according to Canadian officials at the time, it was framed as an attempt to de-escalate and create room for a broader negotiated settlement, rather than fighting a tariff-for-tariff war that was hurting Canadian consumers and businesses just as much as American ones. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender, and it set the stage for everything that followed. Then came a legal twist nobody fully anticipated. In early 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down several of President Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs, the ones imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in the case known as Learning Resources versus Trump. That ruling mattered enormously because it took away one of the president's favorite legal tools for imposing tariffs unilaterally and quickly. It did not end the trade war. It redirected it. Instead of relying on emergency powers that the courts had just limited, the Trump administration pivoted toward older, more narrowly defined statutory authorities, specifically Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law that is now 96 years old and had rarely, if ever, been used at this scale in modern trade policy. Under Section 232, the administration had already imposed 50% tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, 25% on autos, 10% on lumber, and 25% on wooden furniture, according to reporting from the Globe and Mail. These tariffs applied broadly, not just to Canada, but Canada, given how deeply integrated its steel, aluminum, and auto manufacturing supply chains are with the United States, felt them acutely. Then on July 1st, 2026, a deadline passed for extending the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA, for another 16 years. President Trump declined to extend it, The agreement remains technically in force, but it is now subject to annual reviews instead of the long-term certainty businesses on both sides of the border had been counting on. That set up the moment that defines this entire video. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. According to a fact sheet published by the White House and confirmed by trade law analysis from the firm Wiley, these proclamations impose an additional 50% tariff on certain Canadian goods. And critically, this applies even to goods that are fully compliant with the USMCA trade agreement. Normally, USMCA compliant goods are supposed to move across the border duty-free. This order overrides that protection for the targeted categories. The White House fact sheet states the tariffs will not apply to energy, potash, products already covered under Section 232, or certain goods like fish and critical minerals. But for everything else on the list, this is a direct hit on nearly $20 billion a year in Canadian exports to the United States. Why dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicles specifically? According to the White House, the administration determined that Canada discriminates against American exports in exactly those 3 sectors. On dairy and alcohol, the argument centers on Canadian supply management systems and provincial liquor board restrictions that make it harder for American producers to sell into the Canadian market on equal terms with domestic or other foreign competitors. On motor vehicles, the White House fact sheet cites a striking statistic. From April 2025 through March 2026, Canadian imports of American-made motor vehicles fell by approximately 22%, a drop of $5.6 billion compared to the same period a year earlier. At the same time, imports of vehicles from other countries into Canada increased to fill that gap. Washington's argument is that Canadian import quotas on U.S. autos are structured in a way that pressures American car companies to build plants in Canada rather than keep that manufacturing at home. Canada's counter to that argument is layered. Officials in Ottawa maintain that many of these so-called discriminatory measures, particularly the provincial alcohol restrictions, were themselves retaliatory responses to earlier rounds of American tariffs, not unprovoked barriers invented out of nowhere. In other words, Canada argues Washington is punishing Ottawa for countermeasures that Washington's own original tariffs triggered in the first place. It is a classic circular trade dispute, each side pointing to the other as the original aggressor, and untangling who struck first depends entirely on which year you start counting from. The numbers on the alcohol side back up how serious these provincial measures became. According to the same White House fact sheet, from March 2025 through February 2026, Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages collapsed by roughly 81%, a loss of about $582 million. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a near total shutdown of a major export category, driven by provincial liquor boards like the LCBO in Ontario pulling American products from shelves entirely. All but 2 Canadian provinces and territories, according to the White House, have halted the purchase, distribution, or retailing of American alcoholic beverages altogether. So that is the backdrop. Now let's talk about right now, this week, because this is where the phrase final countermove actually starts to earn its place in the story, even if the full picture is more complicated than a single dramatic act. On August 14th, Prime Minister Carney met with all 13 Canadian premiers in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. Following that meeting, Carney told reporters in comments reported by CBC News and Reuters, quote, "Everything is on the table depending on the outcome of the negotiations," end quote. He declined to specify exactly what retaliatory measures Canada is holding in reserve, calling it counterproductive to broadcast his hand while talks are still underway. But he confirmed something important. The federal government has, in his words, worked through its options. This is not an empty threat improvised on the spot. It is a prepared plan waiting for a trigger. British Columbia Premier David Eby added a detail that shows just how seriously provinces are preparing for the worst. He said businesses affected by the tariffs could draw on a federal emergency fund worth $1.5 billion if the 50% duties take effect. And he confirmed, Carney told him that fund has not been exhausted. That is not the language of a government hoping for the best. That is contingency planning at a provincial and federal level simultaneously. Meanwhile, the actual negotiations have been happening in Washington, led on the Canadian side by Minister Dominic LeBlanc. According to the Globe and Mail, citing multiple sources familiar with the talks, negotiators have revived a proposal from the previous year, under which Canada would accept a system of quotas on steel and aluminum exports to the United States, in exchange for President Trump lowering his 50% Section 232 tariffs on those 2 metals. That would be a significant trade-off. Canada accepts a managed, quota-based ceiling on how much steel and aluminum it can sell into the American market, but in exchange gets relief on tariffs that have been squeezing its metals industry for months. But as of this week, that framework has hit a wall, and the wall has a name: Automobiles. According to Bloomberg reporting from August 17th, with less than 36 hours to go before the new tariffs were set to kick in, automotive sector rules had become the single biggest obstacle blocking a deal. Canada has pushed to reduce the tariff rate on autos to 10%, or alternatively, to expand an existing exemption that currently applies to American-made parts used inside vehicles assembled in Canada. The Trump administration, according to people familiar with the discussions who spoke to Bloomberg on condition of anonymity, has held firm at a minimum 15% rate. That 5 percentage point gap might sound small on paper, in an industry where vehicles cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during assembly, sometimes with parts moving back and forth across the border several times before a car is finished. That gap represents billions of dollars, and more importantly, it represents whether entire assembly plants stay open or shut down. There's also a scheduling wrinkle that has quietly complicated the final stretch of talks. LeBlanc was supposed to fly back to Washington on Monday, August 17th to continue negotiations, but according to the Globe and Mail, his plane was actually turned back to Montreal due to weather. Prime Minister Carney himself was in Italy on what was described as a personal trip during this period, and was expected to return to Canada on August 17th, staying in contact with his negotiating team throughout. Brian Clough, a former deputy chief of staff and advisor on Canada-U.S. relations under the previous Trudeau government, told the Globe and Mail that the very fact these talks have continued with such intensity after dragging for months is itself notable. The August 19th deadline, in his assessment, has lit a fire under a process that had previously been stuck in neutral. And here is where the honesty this story requires becomes essential. CBC News, citing Canadian broadcaster Sourcing, reported that as of Monday, August 17th, the two countries were, in their words, at an impasse. Carney himself described the talks to reporters as, quote, very delicate and intense, end quote, and said he planned to speak with President Trump directly before the deadline arrives. That is not the language of a deal that is done. That is the language of a negotiation still genuinely up in the air, less than 48 hours before tariffs are scheduled to take effect. So does that mean the title of this story, the idea that Canada has cornered Trump, is overstated? In some ways, yes. And it is worth being straightforward about that, rather than pretending a dramatic conclusion has already happened when it has not. There is no confirmed deal as of this recording. There is no confirmed collapse of talks either. What has genuinely happened, and this is the verified part, is a shift in leverage dynamics that is worth taking seriously. Consider what Ottawa has actually built over the past year. It has an emergency fund still available for affected businesses. It has near-unanimous provincial cooperation on trade retaliation, something that has not always been easy to coordinate across 13 premiers with very different political priorities. It has already demonstrated, through the alcohol and auto import numbers cited by Washington itself, that Canadian consumers and provincial governments can meaningfully shrink American market share when they choose to. An 81% collapse in American alcohol imports and a 22% drop in American vehicle imports are not just statistics. They are proof that Canadian countermeasures, even informal ones like provincial liquor boards pulling products off shelves, can inflict real, measurable economic pain on American exporters. That track record is precisely why Carney's threat that, quote, everything is on the table, end quote, carries weight instead of sounding like bluster. At the same time, on the American side, there are pressures pushing toward a deal too. Ex-Trump aide Anthony Scaramucci, in comments reported by the Globe and Mail, predicted that the president would, in his phrase, taco on the tariff threat against Canada, using an acronym that has circulated among trade watchers this year, referring to the pattern of the administration threatening severe tariffs and then softening them before or shortly after deadlines actually hit. Whether that prediction holds up by the time you're watching this is genuinely uncertain, and it would be dishonest to tell you otherwise. What is verified is that intensive, high-level talks have continued right up to the wire, that a framework involving steel and aluminum quotas has been seriously discussed, and that automotive tariff rates remain the single point where negotiators have not yet found common ground. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on just how unusual the legal tool behind these tariffs actually is, because this detail changes how seriously trade lawyers are taking this entire episode. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is part of the same law commonly known as Smoot-Hawley, named after its original congressional sponsors, Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon. President Herbert Hoover signed the original Smoot-Hawley Act into law on June 17, 1930, and economic historians widely blame it for deepening the Great Depression because it raised average tariff rates by roughly 20% and triggered a wave of retaliation from close to 24 countries within 2 years, according to reporting from Axios. One of the hardest-hit industries at the time was American auto manufacturing, which saw exports collapse by roughly 46% as other nations retaliated, based on figures from the National Bureau of Economic Research. According to trade attorney Peter Harrell, a visiting scholar at Georgetown's Institute for International Economic Law, Section 338 has not been used to impose tariffs since the 1930s or 1940s, and by his account, may never have actually been invoked at all before this July. That assessment is echoed by the law firm Brownstein, which noted in its own client analysis that the authority does not appear to have previously been used to impose tariffs in the entire history of the statute. In other words, this is not simply a tariff dispute using a familiar tool the White House has used before, the way earlier rounds of tariffs relied on more commonly used trade laws. This is the revival of a 96-year-old essentially dormant legal provision, and according to a Reason magazine guest analysis co-authored by Harrell and Georgetown professor Jennifer Hillman, even past administrations, including Franklin D. Roosevelt's, considered using Section 338 and chose not to follow through. President Trump is, by these accounts, the first president in the law's history to actually pull that particular trigger. Why does that legal history matter for the story unfolding this week? Because it explains why so many trade lawyers immediately flagged the move as likely to face legal scrutiny. And it explains why the timing lines up so precisely with the Supreme Court's ruling earlier in 2026, striking down the administration's emergency tariff powers. According to Axios reporting, once the courts narrowed those emergency authorities, the White House first tried replacing the invalidated tariffs with a 10% global levy under a different, also rarely used authority, Section 122, before turning to Section 338 specifically for the Canada-focused action in July. Carl Shimata, chief market strategist at the financial services firm Corpay, told Axios that the new Section 338 duties would raise the average tariff rate on Canadian goods by roughly 2.3 percentage points overall, a modest-sounding number that masks how concentrated the pain is within the specific sectors actually targeted. There's also a notable admission buried inside the White House's own justification for these tariffs, one that reinforces Canada's argument about who provoked whom. According to analysis published in Forbes, the White House fact sheet itself states that since the start of President Trump's second term, only 2 countries have, in the administration's own words, chosen to retaliate against U.S. exports rather than renegotiate a revised trade agreement, and it names those 2 countries as China and Canada. Trade commentators have pointed out that this statement effectively concedes that Canada's actions were a response, a countermeasure, to tariffs Washington imposed first, rather than an unprovoked act of discrimination invented independently by Ottawa. Economist Paul Krugman made a similar point in his own newsletter analysis, arguing that the provincial alcohol restrictions the White House cites as justification were themselves reactions to earlier American tariffs, and separately, reactions to President Trump's repeated public suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state, comments that many Canadians treated as a direct challenge to their country's sovereignty rather than as idle talk. None of this legal and historical context changes the practical reality facing businesses this week, which is that the tariffs are real, dated, and enforceable starting August 19th, regardless of how the underlying legal authority is ultimately judged in court. But it does help explain why this dispute carries weight beyond a typical tariff announcement. When the tool being used has not been touched in nearly a century, and legal scholars are already drafting analyses of how it might be challenged, that tells you the Trump administration views this as a serious structural pressure campaign against Ottawa, not a routine adjustment. It's also worth noting what these tariffs actually cover, because the scope goes further than the headline categories of autos, dairy, and alcohol suggest. According to trade analysis from Thomson Reuters, the covered goods extend into a much broader list, including various foodstuffs and beverages beyond just alcohol, wood products beyond just lumber, paper goods, textiles, and certain machinery categories, in addition to the widely reported items like hockey sticks and cement. The full list is contained in Annex the front of the formal proclamations covering the autos, alcohol, and dairy declarations. According to the law firm Brownstein, the proclamations do include a 30-day window for negotiations before the tariffs actually take effect, which is precisely the window that expires on August 19th, and explains why both governments have been negotiating so intensively in these final days, rather than simply accepting the tariffs as a fait accompli from the moment they were announced. Let's talk about what happens if no deal is reached in time. If the 50% tariffs take effect as scheduled on August 19th, the immediate economic impact falls on a specific list of goods. According to NBC News reporting, that list includes hockey sticks, certain clothing items, wines, some dairy products, and building materials like cement and plywood. NBC also reported that Canadian officials have described the White House's justification as being about, quote, leveling the playing field for crucial American exports, cars, alcohol, and dairy, end quote, language taken directly from White House statements on the matter. On the American side, businesses that import Canadian goods have already been told to prepare. According to trade law firm Wiley, companies importing Canadian-origin goods should promptly review whether their products fall within the newly covered tariff classifications, assess their potential duty exposure beginning August 19th, and evaluate inventory, sourcing, and shipment timing strategies in anticipation of the change. That is not hypothetical advice. That is active guidance being given to real companies right now this week, because the deadline is real and enforceable, regardless of how negotiations conclude. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it shows just how tangled the auto sector sticking point really is. The reason automotive rules have become the single hardest issue to resolve is not simply about the headline tariff percentage. It comes down to how North American car manufacturing actually works. A single vehicle assembled in a plant in Ontario might contain an engine built in Michigan, a transmission built in Indiana, and dozens of smaller components that cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times at different stages before final assembly. That is the legacy of decades of integration under NAFTA and then USMCA, an approach designed specifically to treat the North American auto industry as one interconnected system, rather than three separate national industries. When Canada asks for a 10% rate or a wider exemption for American-made parts, it is trying to protect that integrated system. An assembly plant in Windsor or Oshawa cannot simply swap out cross-border parts overnight without retooling supply chains that took years to build. When the Trump administration holds at a 15% minimum, it is signaling that it wants to use tariff pressure specifically to shift more of that manufacturing and parts sourcing back onto American soil, even if that means short-term disruption, for an industry that has operated on a cross-border model for a generation. That is why this specific dispute, more than the dairy or alcohol categories, is the one negotiators have struggled hardest to resolve, and why Bloomberg's sourcing described it as the main obstacle blocking a broader deal with barely a day and a half left on the clock. It's also worth putting this dispute in a wider economic context, because tariffs of this size do not stay contained to the two governments involved. According to NBC News, both American and Canadian officials and economists have warned that tariffs at this scale threaten to push inflation higher on both sides of the border. There is also a political dimension inside Canada that shapes how much room Carney actually has to maneuver. His now famous pledge, repeated many times over the past year according to Bloomberg, that, quote, Canada will not accept a bad deal, end quote, is not just rhetoric aimed at Washington. It is also aimed at his own domestic political coalition. Political opposition inside Canada, including from conservative critics, has at various points accused the Liberal government of being too accommodating toward Washington, using the slogan elbows down to suggest Carney's government softened its posture compared to the more combative stance Canadians initially wanted after the trade war began in 2025. That domestic pressure matters because it constrains how much Carney can concede in these final negotiations without facing a political backlash at home, even if a modest deal would technically be better for the Canadian economy than letting the 50% tariffs hit. Meanwhile, on the American side, the Trump administration has been framing its broader tariff strategy, including the pressure on Canada, as part of a larger push to revive American manufacturing. According to the White House fact sheet in May of 2026, U.S. manufacturing grew at what the administration called its fastest rate in 4 years, nearly tripling expectations. And by June 2026, manufacturing had expanded for a sixth consecutive month. Whether the Canada-specific tariffs deserve credit for that broader manufacturing trend is a separate and more contested question, one that trade economists disagree on, since the manufacturing expansion reflects a combination of factors, including tariffs on multiple countries, domestic investment incentives, and broader economic conditions, not Canada policy in isolation. This script is not going to claim a direct causal link that the available sourcing does not clearly establish. What can be stated plainly is that the White House is citing the manufacturing numbers as validation for its overall tariff approach, Canada included. So where does that leave things right now with the clock still running? As of the most recent reporting available from the morning of Monday, August 17th into that evening, negotiators from both countries remain locked in talks, with automotive tariff rates as the primary sticking point, a revived steel and aluminum quota framework on the table but not finalized, and Prime Minister Carney holding a planned direct conversation with President Trump before the deadline arrives. Nothing is confirmed as settled. Nothing is confirmed as collapsed. Ottawa's leverage, built over 18 months of tariffs, counter-tariffs, provincial boycotts, and a demonstrated willingness to let those measures bite into American exports, has clearly changed the tone of these negotiations, compared to where things stood even a few months ago. Whether that leverage is enough to force a genuinely favorable deal for Canada before August 19th, or whether the 50% tariffs go into effect and both economies absorb the consequences, while talks continue afterward, is something that will be determined in the next 48 hours, not something that has already happened. Before we close, let's be transparent about where this information comes from and what remains uncertain, because that transparency matters more than a tidy, dramatic ending. The tariff details, the July 20th proclamations, and the White House's stated justifications for the 50% duties come directly from a White House fact sheet and are corroborated by trade law analysis published by the firm Wiley. The negotiation details, including the steel and aluminum quota proposal and the automotive sticking point, come from Bloomberg and the Globe and Mail, both citing sources familiar with the closed-door talks who were not publicly named, which is standard practice in trade reporting, but does mean those specific details carry a slightly lower certainty than the officially confirmed tariff proclamations themselves. Prime Minister Carney's public comments about retaliation being, quote, on the table, end quote, are drawn from CBC News and Reuters coverage of his remarks in Charlottetown. The Supreme Court ruling and the broader trade war timeline are documented in extensive public records and contemporaneous news coverage spanning 2025 and 2026. What remains genuinely unverified as of this recording is the final outcome, whether a deal is reached before August 19th, what any retaliatory measures from Canada would specifically target if talks fail, and whether the ex-aide's prediction of a last-minute American reversal proves accurate. Anthony Scaramucci's taco prediction, in particular, is his personal analysis and forecast, not a confirmed fact, and should be understood as informed speculation from someone with insider experience, not as established reporting. What does seem clear, based on everything verified here, is that this is no longer a trade dispute where Canada is simply reacting to whatever Washington decides. Ottawa has built real, demonstrated economic leverage. It has provincial unity behind its negotiating position. It has a prepared financial safety net for affected businesses, and it has shown a willingness to let painful economic measures run their course rather than blink first, as it did briefly back in August of 2025 when it pulled back its own retaliatory tariffs to try to de-escalate. Whether that adds up to Trump being genuinely cornered or simply facing a negotiating partner that has finally learned to play a longer, more patient game is something you can judge for yourself once the dust settles after August 19th. It is worth remembering, too, that Ottawa's current position did not emerge overnight. It is the product of 18 months of trial and error, starting with an aggressive tit-for-tat response in early 2025, followed by a strategic retreat later that same year, when Canada judged that matching tariff for tariff was inflicting as much damage on its own economy as on Washington's. What has changed since then is patience and coordination rather than aggression. Carney's government spent the months in between building consensus across 13 premiers with very different economic interests, from oil-producing Alberta to manufacturing-heavy Ontario to the smaller Atlantic provinces, all of whom have signed onto a shared negotiating posture heading into this deadline. That kind of unified provincial front was not guaranteed, and past trade disputes in Canadian history have sometimes fractured along exactly those regional lines. The fact that it held together through this particular standoff is arguably as important to Ottawa's leverage as any single retaliatory tariff on the table. So here is the honest, open question worth sitting with. If you were advising Prime Minister Carney right now, with less than 2 days on the clock, and automotive tariffs the last unresolved issue, would you tell him to hold the line and let the 50% tariffs take effect on principle, betting that the economic pain forces a better deal later? Or would you tell him to make the concession on auto tariffs now, take a workable deal today, and avoid the immediate damage to Canadian exporters and consumers, even if the terms aren't perfect? There is no obviously correct answer here, and reasonable people on both sides of the border disagree. Drop your take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of decision where the safe, textbook answer and the politically survivable answer are not always the same thing, and Carney has to live with whichever one he chooses in the next 48 hours. If you found this breakdown useful for understanding what's actually happening at the border this week, rather than just another tariff headline without context, consider subscribing so you don't miss how this resolves, because whatever happens on August 19th is going to shape Canada-U. S-trade for years, not just weeks. And if you know someone who ships goods across that border, works in the auto industry, or just wants to actually understand this dispute instead of the shouting match version of it, share this with them. It might genuinely help them make sense of what's coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with an update the moment this deadline resolves one way or the other.